Earlier this week, EU Commission President Jean-Claude Juncker called for the creation of an EU army, saying that it would, quote, convey a clear message to Russia that we are serious about defending our European values. Not everybody was thrilled with this idea, and dissension almost immediately emerged after the statement was made. The UK said that defense was a national, not an EU responsibility, and even NATO voiced its criticisms. The Atlantic Alliance expressed concerns that an EU army would lead to overlap and redundancy with the responsibilities already carried out by the group. This is what we are going to discuss in our second section, Between the Lines, focusing on the most thought-provoking publications of the week. In an article entitled The EU and Whose Army, carried by Bloomberg View, the publication wrote that Europe has been talking about creating a common military since 1950. France killed the idea back then, and for a decade, the European Defense Agency has been tasked with pooling capabilities and coordinating production among Europe's defense industries. It hasn't achieved much. That doesn't bode well for any attempt to form a pan-European force, which would require sacrificing national sovereignty over the decision to put soldiers in harm's way. The article continues by saying, a more practical recommendation made this week by Samantha Power, U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, would be for European nations to simply meet their commitments to NATO.
Well, Andrew, you know, the time is running fast, and I remember how 15 years back, same March day, I was filing a story on European army, and this was probably the first time when the idea was announced. And that really sounded exotic because everybody was saying, why Europe all of a sudden needs an army when the NATO is there, Americans are there. So, but still, during that time, the logic was that, and the motivation was that European Union just is making one step after another just to integrate. So if European Union will have its own foreign policy, it will have to have its own security policy, and it will have to have an instrument just to translate this policy into action. But what is most interesting to me, that during that time, few people remember, so the basic idea was for Europe to get more and more independence from Americans, and more independence from NATO. And look how things changed in 15 years. No one could have imagined that today, the motive would be entirely different, and they're really trying to put a new steam into the process of creating a European army, which initially looked like a non-starter, referring to alleged Russian threat.
Well, I think it's pretty interesting in this whole topic, and I'd like to actually ask our first question to our in-studio guest, Mr. Ernest Sultanov, expert and coordinator at the Mir Initiative independent think tank in Moscow. Mr. Sultanov, we know everyone's talking about this perceived Russian threat, but I want to ask you as an expert, I think there could be more here, and that this proposed EU army could possibly be applied to other threats in other regions. What's your take on this? Do you think there's more to it?
We can make just one example. Middle East that is changing dramatically and probably will be reshaped within the next decade. That is why all the major players are arming themselves. Chinese, Russians, Americans as well. So the only exclusion from this list of countries of the players were Europeans, and they were till recently doing the opposite actually. With the economical crisis, it was difficult for the governments, European governments, to sustain the military spending. So you need a strong reason for this, to explain to your voters why should you spend money not on social but on military. That's why the common threat is very useful and very needed by the supporters of the stronger Europe.
Well, but Mr. Sultanov, then explain me, you said about exceptions. Why Europe can't remain an exception? Why Europe can't be, exercise its strength with its soft power, not with military power, economic power? Why Europe needs an army?
Because you're talking about Europe or European states. This is the core issue.
Yeah, this is the core issue. Yes. That's what the British saying, that we have to have national army. We don't.
Actually, it's a point, because in order to be Europe, in order to be not just a simple union, but a kind of player on the world scale, you need to have not only economical and soft power, but you need a kind of strong power that is military.
But that's, you say, this is the logic behind the idea.
Actually, yes, but in order to fulfill this, to realize this, you need a kind of explanation. You need to bring everybody inside this. So you need a threat, and that's why the threat was created.
But let me put it bluntly. Do you think it can work, the idea?
it can work because it's needed, because everybody knows very well that the next future, the next 10, 20 years will be a kind of struggle for the resources. So in order to control the resources, you need military, and you cannot fulfill this duty with only single armies or single forces. So you need a kind of common strength. Yes, this is army.
Yes, what I'm very interested in is the justification for creating this. As you and Sergei were debating, and it makes me wonder, I mean, one of the gospels of the EU, if you will, is so-called human rights. And I'm wondering if justification of human rights, in this case, all the migrants leaving North Africa to go to Europe, and, Italy is unprepared for dealing with this, could be used as a justification for arguing to EU voters.
Unfortunately not, because it concerns basically and mostly the South European countries. For example, Italy, that suffers a lot from these immigration flows. But actually, what should I care if I live in some northern country about the flows of immigrants from Libya or from Africa? But considering that there is a kind of huge propaganda now about this, the current political situation and the crisis, so the threat of kind of a possible enemy on your eastern border, considering the past and considering the historical prejudice, can become real. And so you will not pay attention to the flows of immigrants if you will live in the northern country, but you will pay attention to the threat coming from some difficult, some very powerful neighbor. So that's why this threat, and in this case Russia is unfortunately is instrumental to create a stronger Europe. But it's it's an interesting question: in which interest is this united European force, this future European army? Will it benefit, for example, the Americans, or will it benefit more Russians?
No, this is a really good question that I'd like to address to our next guest, Mr. Jan van Bentham, the foreign commentator of the Netherlands Daily.
Red Line.
Mr. van Bentham, thank you for joining us.
Yeah, good morning.
Hi, so we're wondering whose interest would this EU army be? Because from what I've been reading, Poland, Lithuania, and even the UK think it's a bad idea that there would be overlap with NATO or sovereignty issues. So who really supports it, and whose interest would it be in your opinion?
The European Union. This is especially propagated by Mr. Juncker, the chairman of the Commission. He said this to Welt und Sonntag in Germany. He wanted to have it, as he said, as a token of European strength. But behind this is a very strong seizure of opinion, so difference of opinion between the United States and the EU, and especially Germany, on the attitude towards Russia in the Ukrainian issue, the Ukrainian conflict. There is large difficulties within, especially Germany, the German government, with, for instance, the bellicosity, the enmity, which is showed by the American General Breedlove, who is commander of the NATO forces in Europe. He is using very hard language, which Angela Merkel, the German Chancellor, is not liking so much, because that hinders any possibility of negotiations. And as you know, the Minsk negotiations now have some results in the withdrawal of heavy arms, whereas Breedlove is talking about many tanks coming to Ukraine from the Russian border, etc. And Germany says, well, we do see some Russian weaponry, but they're not heavy tanks. They're, at best, they're armed vehicles, armed carriers, but not main battle tanks. So there is a very strong difference between what the U.S. general now is saying, and also the hard words, especially from U.S. Congress, and what Europe tries to attain. So if you would have a European army, you would be more independent. That idea is already very long. There is already a very long kind of attempt to create a sort of European army. You have the so-called European battle groups, but in effect they are the same as the Rapid Reaction Force of NATO. They're the same troops. They are not two kinds of troops. They're the same troops. And I myself have visited, for instance, the European Defence Agency, which is in Brussels, which already for many years was trying to have this European cooperation, and it doesn't take off. It just doesn't take off. It just doesn't work.
I think, Mr. Jan, that judging by what you say, this looks really like a stillborn project. like a dead project.
At the moment, regarding all the problems you have in the European Union, about the Union itself, about the solidarity within the Union, the political differences, the possible Brexit, the referendum that will come in Great Britain if the Conservative Party will again win the elections. You will have a referendum on whether to stay in the European Union, yes or no. The European Union is in an existential crisis. And now talking about a European army, I'm very sorry. These are very nice clouds in a very summery sky, but they're not reality.
Yes, well, that's a very good comment, and I think that's a very provocative way to end this section, because we've run out of time, unfortunately. So thank you, Mr. Van Bentham, for joining us and offering your insight today.
Red Line.
Joining us right now, we have Mr. Jeff Steinberg, Counterintelligence Editor for Executive Intelligence Review. We've been discussing the topic of an EU army that was proposed by Jean-Claude Juncker, and I'm wondering here, he says that this would specifically send a signal to Russia, and the question is this really in Europe's interest to send whatever vague signal he's alluding to, or perhaps in the United States' interest? Or what's your take on this?
Well, first of all, I think that the proposal has to be evaluated from the reality standpoint of, is it even feasible? Now, the fact of the matter is that virtually every European country has gone through a significant scaling back of their conventional military capabilities. Britain, for example, is on the verge of reducing their conventional armed forces strength to a grand total of about 50,000 soldiers, including Army, Marines, Navy. So the European capabilities are dubious for starters. Secondly, this has, I think, inadvertently revived an old debate that goes back to the 1980s when there was a question about the reinforcement of Europe's status within NATO versus creating a separate and independent EU fighting force outside of the NATO command. There's not much capability in Europe, so this whole issue was seen by the United States as an attempt to create something that would be, if anything, a diverting of resources away from the centralized NATO mission. The danger I see is that given the fact that the European military force, particularly relative to Russian capability, is so diminished and so small that it encourages much more provocative behavior. For example, the U.S. is pre-positioning military equipment in the Baltic states and in other parts of Eastern Europe among the NATO countries that are right on the border with Russia.
What do you think about, instead of this pan-EU army, one of the trends I'm kind of looking at is regional fighting forces. For example, a fighting force centered on the Visegrad Group, or what we see right now, the talk of a Polish, Lithuanian, Ukrainian brigade. We potentially see a bunch of smaller regional armies sprouting up in Europe that might form the basis for this pan-EU force.
The danger, once more, is that it harkens back to certain bad ideas that were widely circulated around at the worst and most dangerous moments of the Cold War. You know, there's this, intermaritime region that covers the area between the Baltic Sea and the Black Sea, which does encompass a number of the countries that you're talking about. There's been talk about some kind of a joint military force. But when you start getting into military operations that involve NATO countries and non-NATO countries, then you're further blurring the lines on the question of the collective security element of the NATO treaty. So all of these ideas, to my mind, are very bad and very dangerous. I would rather see a revival of the NATO-Russia Council.
Okay, Mr. Steinberg, unfortunately, this is all that we have for now, so I'd like to thank you very much for offering your insight. Unfortunately, this is all that we have for the second section, so I'd like to thank all of our guests for participating, beginning with our in-studio guest, Mr. Ernest Sultanov, an expert and coordinator at the Mir Initiative independent think tank here in Moscow, Mr. Jeff Steinberg, counterintelligence editor for Executive Intelligence Review, and last but not least, Mr. Jan van Bentham, the foreign commentator of the Netherlands Daily. Following in our program, we have Hillary Clinton, ready for Emailgate. Stay with us.